So we're looking at how the ecosystem can overcome the challenges of collaboration to combat fraud. A very interesting topic. It's been touched upon in some of our previous discussions, but let's really dig into it now. I'm going to start with Mark here. Can I ask you, what does good and bad collaboration look like when it comes to tackling fraud? Any examples you can give, and how does it?
Yeah, absolutely, and nice to meet everyone in between beer, so conscious, try not to go on too long. I mean, good collaboration for me is about, I suppose, removing competition and removing personal ambition from the conversation. That's often been the challenge in my experience of where personal ambition gets in the way, or of actually getting everyone together and having an honest conversation. I think, we've talked about, I'll just touch on some of the bad areas where I think where we've failed as an industry yet in collaboration yet is cross-border. I think it's one of the big frustrations I have when I speak to colleagues in the Netherlands or other countries, and we've got a load of bank account information here. We could share with you where we know funds from the Netherlands have gone. We don't have that confidence yet to share across borders. So I think that's one for me that we need to tackle. I think in terms of good, I think one colleague in the room, I'll get shot if I don't mention Cifas, and I don't know how many people know of Cifas. I'm not going to put the hands up as well either, but Cifas is 35 years old. We are a non-for-profit membership organisation that operates in the UK. We share data and intelligence between around 670 organisations now. So, and that means basically when something goes wrong, if fraudulent conduct is detected at one of our members, other members can benefit from that. And that can be the fact that someone's been a victim, so we're protecting people from identity theft. I think Dianne touched on that earlier. That is still the largest filings that we see to Cifas is around stolen identities. And then in terms of pushing that out across other members, we have various mechanisms to do that. So I think that's been really successful, and I think often it's one of those unknown means, we see a filing every 60 seconds. We have about 500,000 cases filed every year. And that operates over 13 sectors. So it started from industry being told by the police many years ago, industry needs to do something about protecting itself from fraud. Industry got together, and that's grown at such a scale now. That includes mobile operators, all the retail banks, mortgage providers, retailers, gamblers, and that, for me, has been massively successful collaboration. We can just do more with that now. It'd be great.
Perfect. David, same topic. Can I ask you, do you have any examples you would like to give, good or bad collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's been multiple examples. I think, obviously, what I've observed with working with both law enforcement but also in industry and with the GSMA is that I guess the issue can be handled in a sort of quite parochial manner. So individual countries like the UK, for example, will say, this is a massive issue and here's how we're going to deal with it. And they'll deal with, say, just the UK operators. But of course, it's a global issue. And while there are different characteristics in different countries and different regions, often language related, it's fundamentally international. And what I see, the sort of challenges of sort of collaboration, particularly with law enforcement, is often countries, LEAs will say, oh, that's abroad. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, as a criminal, I don't care. And I'm actually taking advantage of that. So it's absolutely paramount that we really, as the good guys, work together, which is actually the closing remarks of the last panel. And I think we need to sort of try to avoid tripping over each other as well, because what may be a good solution in one country may fundamentally not work in another country, or the root cause may be something entirely different, so it might be massively wasted resource. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it in a minute, but the issue of GT leasing by operators across the world, so global title leasing being a root cause problem to lots and lots of different types of fraud, but also very, very severe effects, commercial spyware, resulting in people losing their lives, being tortured, massive human rights issues. Those types of things have to be dealt with at a sort of global level. So yeah, I really, really do think that we have to work together, and knowing about each other's initiatives is only going to help.
Perfect. And Dianne, I know you're very collaborative as an organisation, and I'm sure as a person as well. Can you give me any good examples of collaboration you've been involved in?
Yeah, I mean, and all of them, well, the first few will be very relevant to this industry. So the first initiative would have been a piece we did with Ofcom several years ago about the Do Not Originate list, where we were trying to protect bank numbers so that consumers couldn't be duped by criminals impersonating them. We then tried to do an equivalent for SMS, and that was like arranging a wedding to get that one kicked off. But yeah, we've done quite well with the sender ID registry, and obviously with the additional builds the government's done by the online charters, that continues to progress. And then the last one I just referred to earlier about sharing, if someone's on a risky call during a payment transaction, that was done by the GSMA. So depending on the way you need to engage with industry and the different stakeholders may actually determine what's the best vehicle and mechanism. We've also used reference data, so like in the investment sector, if our banks have a list of genuine account details, then when someone's claiming to be making an investment, we can reference that, put in greater restrictions, and those types of things. So that's more reference data. Quite a few of them are reference data, and some of them more live and using modeling and stuff. You've got to be able to adapt to the different issues that you're seeing and what's viable. Sometimes you can't get the golden, but if you can just raise the barrier, that's still good.
Perfect. And Simeon, if I can come to you. In a fraud context, what do you see as helping or holding back collaboration between ecosystem partners right now?
So certainly, I think helping, one of the key characteristics is having clearly set objectives, or at least a common language on, why am I doing this? Because, what might be important to me may be just an irrelevant piece of data for somebody else. I need to know why I should be working. But I would say, in terms of hindrance, we have this assumption that sharing is good. And, in many, many, many cases, it is. If we know about victims, we can then protect them across other services. But knowing what to share with whom and why is utterly critical, because the very first thing we find is when you have collaboration, of course, it means distribution of information. If you're not careful about who receives that, the very first thing that the bad actors are going to do is go, have they found out about me? And so we have to be careful on who's got access to what, why are we doing it. Let's find mechanisms to ensure if it has been compromised, how can we detect that, how can we manage that to avoid the system being gamed against us.
Perfect. Mark, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. One of the dangers always, I'll focus on data sharing, you touched on there, is technically it's actually relatively simple to build databases and plug them together and share information. If you look at the Cifas model, more than 50%, let's say that's £5 million a year, is spent on governance and data integrity with our members and around the data and protecting that, making it sure it's used in the right way. We deal with thousands of consumer inquiries. So I would say, what I always talk about it, we're above the parapet, which is really, really important. We talk about data protection, people talk about GDPR today. Very easy to put something and hope no one finds out. You've got to make that conscious decision, we'll do this right, and it's visible. So I think the governance and integrity are absolutely key parts.
Perfect. And Mark, from a GSMA perspective, anything you would add?
Oh, David.
Sorry.
It's the second time I've been called Mark today, actually, but it must look like Mark. I maybe slightly disagree with Simeon. I think if you're starting from a point where you're not sharing anything, your attackers have a fundamental advantage, and they're collaborating all over the place, right? So they're sharing intelligence between themselves as to what's usable. And I think, what we're actually entering a period of now is that there is intelligence sharing, but there's a lot of sort of private companies, often vendors, that are sat on intelligence from their customers, and they've written into contracts with their customers, the operators, and saying, we will be able to use your data back against the previous panel. But then they're not sharing that with the rest of industry. So you've got these silos where they can't see the whole of the picture. They can only see the set of operators that are their customers. That is fundamentally bad for security. And we are going to see, whichever painful route that we take, we're going to see that has to be broken down. because that's fundamentally bad for us tackling fraud. There are other issues about data quality. Again, back to an earlier discussion about numbering. We do have some fundamental structural issues that technologically will need to be solved, which is about the assurance of the integrity and the authenticity of identifiers. Because otherwise, I was going to swear a little bit then, but we're kind of never going to be able to deal with it. And I think we're seeing this with, I guess, with stir shaken a little bit. Is, if I can pick a phone number out of thin air, I can choose any number I want. There is no way of assuring that integrity, and we will have to tackle that issue in the future. The same with IMEI numbers. And again, I think these are the sort of future challenges to collaborative sharing and to, I guess, the integrity of that sharing, the trustworthiness of that sharing, that somebody can take action on that they believe it is actually an authentic identifier.
Thanks, David. Got it right that time. Dianne, can I ask you, what more needs to be done to accelerate collaboration between different ecosystem partners?
I think it actually comes back to Simeon's point around level understanding in terms of your common, what's the common language. Because even to today, we have different terminology we use in terms of purchase scam and card and e-commerce fraud. And so when you're talking to online platforms, they're referring to all of it as purchase scams, or people refer to all of fraud. But the way we define it is dependent on what's happening. The customer's getting manipulated, but sometimes they're carrying out the entirety of the transaction themselves willingly, versus other times they haven't got a clue what's going on. They've just had certain credentials taken so that the criminal can carry out the action. And what you can do in those different scenarios varies, and the impact it will have will vary. So making sure everyone's on the same page, otherwise some people will be putting in a lot of work for a very small proportion of the problem space. So I think that's critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Simeon, can I come to you? Would you add anything to what Dianne's just said about how you could accelerate collaboration?
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, first of all, I just want to acknowledge, I think, the statement that Simon made on the previous panel. I mean, absolutely everyone says, you've got to have your own legal advice, but getting some level of guidelines, oh my God, if we had more support on that, more starting points, because we've got to start talking to a lawyer. Well, what guidance do you give them? That would be immensely helpful. And again, likewise, I think it gives us a common framework to be able to describe what it is that we want to do. I think the other aspect, though, I would touch upon is liability. Because, of course, you get the question, as soon as somebody says, right, okay, I want to do this, okay, well, have you got an obligation to that? What responsibility are you now inheriting as a result of that? And I think collaboration is also about, well, who's got what responsibility to do what with that information. If I tell you something, have you now got a responsibility to act upon it? So I think that there's a whole set of additional questions about not just sort of the information itself, but what does that now entail that needs to be raised?
Yeah, very good point. David, if I can come back to you now, how do we avoid overlaps between the different industry organizations' efforts? So you're here with your GSMA hat on. You collaborate with MEF, of course, and I'm sure many other groups. But how do we avoid overlapping efforts?
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing, obviously, is communication, and thanks to MEF for inviting me to this, because we've, during my tenure as chair, have very much tried to ensure that we work with all of the different organisations, because we're all on the same side here ultimately, and also there's a good overlap in the memberships as well of the different companies. So I think it's really incumbent on those memberships and the administration of those organisations to sort of deconflict where necessary, but also to communicate with each other to say, well, if I've got this piece and you've got this piece, well, how does that work well together? And, from my perspective, I don't want us to kind of waste a lot of time working on something that someone else is doing just as well, because there are a ton of problems that we can work on. So I think that's really my sort of pragmatic way of dealing with it.
But it's often a case of you don't know who else is working on it, is what I found. And at any one time, you find lots of different organizations doing the same kind of thing. But
Yeah,
it's very tricky. Dianne, any comments?
I think you'll see that Mark and I are laughing because we actually have routine check-ins because our members routinely place the same things with us, stop scams, them, and so we have to deconflict and figure out who's going to do what bits and how we can work together effectively. Because you're right, we would like to be working on different parts of the problem or use our various strengths. Like we might start something, they might finish it, or somebody else might start something and we finish it. So, but yeah, and given some of the institutions, in particular in the banking sector, some of them will have 70,000 employees, it is quite easy when they have lots of different products and different channels to end up with different people talking to different institutions about what they want to do at different levels. So it's a constant battle, but I think we're trying to win.
And Mark, you were smiling as well, but do you see any examples of overlap and how can it be overcome?
Yeah, I think it's always going to happen. I think, and Dianne touched on it there, the organisation we're dealing with, let alone as a member, are so big, there's so many people looking at different areas. We're going to get asked the same question. I think, it is about having those open lines of communication. It's all knowing our strengths as well, what we're good at, what we bring to the party, and being, clear enough that where we're good and what parts we play, and how we bring the right people to the table. When we get that right, I think, look at some of the campaigns over the years, Take 5, and which obviously led by UK Finance, but supported by everyone got behind. Fantastic initiative. Some of the work we're doing at the moment around PHSC, where we're all getting together around education into schools. It works, but you've got to talk, and it's hard. You've got to work at it, and you've got to keep talking all the time, because it's very easy when you go back to the office to go back into your own little silos sometimes.
How do you think, anybody can chip in here, but how do you think the prospect of regulation might change collaboration?
Well, we're seeing it already, right? So we're seeing it with, obviously I work a lot in the IoT space, but what we've seen is countries collaborating more. So the work that I did on the UK's Code of Practice for IoT Security became an ETSI EN, so an international European norms and as a standard, and then adopted across the world. And that wasn't by accident. That the UK translated that code into the major languages of the major countries in the world, and they promoted it and they worked with other countries. Everybody had the same problem, and I would love to see similar type of action in the fraud space, but we have also seen it in things like network equipment assurance. So again, countries are collaborating together to make sure that they get economies of scale out of the work, and that they actually refer to, say, the GSMA's FS31 baseline security work, for example, or the NISA scheme, and that it's actually not having to reinvent the wheel, and that helps industry, it helps consumers, and it helps the manufacturers of those products. It's basically just not wasting economic resources and energy duplicating things all the time.
Mm. And Simeon, when it comes to collaboration, how do you see regulation playing out versus self-regulation?
Certainly at the moment, it still feels like we're maybe in an early stage of regulation for a number of these things. Frankly, fraud will always exist at the front end beyond regulation. That's inevitable. Fraudsters can change far faster than regulators, and we will never, ever change that. But I think, though, what does play in is the fact that there are systems and processes to be able to rapidly scale this out. I think, David, your example just there of ETSI, that is a global standard. Once things get adopted at that point, it's then hard for fraudsters to achieve that same level of velocity and scale. So it takes a huge amount of work to get up to that point, but then there's an inflection point, and I think that's possibly the space that regulation or self-regulation can inhabit, which is to say, okay, once we've got something really good, how do we then increase that speed and get it adopted?
You guys have got a prime example, actually, because so Adaptivemobile are leading a work item called Motive, which is a mobile threat intelligence framework, and that is based around existing standards that were created by MITRE that are widely used in the IT industry. So kind of sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, really, but leaning into existing machine-readable standards and then sort of changing that to make sure that it's ready for the telecoms industry. And it's working, right?
Yeah. Exactly that. I mean, well, just to the point, it's a way of describing things, so we're saying a common terminology, At the end of the day, there's very few new problems. I think the biggest barrier is not recognizing that there are existing mechanisms and processes to be able to do this type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. We're also seeing fraud shifting and adapting, as it always does, moving increasingly to online platforms. Quite a big theme now. How does it affect collaboration between different industry partners? I mean, maybe, Mark, you can jump in first.
Yeah, and it always, I think we saw a change a few years ago, I think, in terms of, we touched on it before, of people moving away from identity fraud, although still that's the largest thing we see, is to let's get the genuine person to do this. And obviously online platforms are a form of recruitment, and Dianne touched before about telecoms in some areas is still the dominant thing there. So I think we've got to bring those industries together. I think we're very sectorized in terms of regulation, and that's a challenge still to be able to come. The PS, payment sector services regulations that are coming around liability when a scam happens, still very tightly in the financial services space. So I think, as being probably coming back to that previous question, will regulation go broad enough to bring more players in that will force it, or will industry go, actually, let's make sure we all play our part? And I still, Stop Scams are doing a brilliant job of bringing those people to the table in the big tech, which for the first time, I think, which is great. Yeah. But we need to bring all those communities together at once.
I mean, it feels like the sector knows how to collaborate with MNO'S because it's been a long-standing collaboration. Does it know how to collaborate with the likes of Meta?
So, I mean, we've got the online fraud group, which is a collaboration between the National Economic Crime Centre and UK Finance, and also Tech UK, representing the online platforms and bringing them in to work on specific things. But a lot of it is about the narrative. A lot of it is about the fact that they're global and they want solutions that can be played out globally. They don't want localized solutions. Plus, we used to see this many years ago in telecoms, like fraud was a subset of nuisance calls. So you go to the regulator, it's a smaller bucket. And so if you go to a platform, they might tell you they're taking down 14 billion fake accounts 97% before it's reported. But how does that actually relate to fraud? What does it mean in fraudulent terms? Because a lot of that might just be, nuisance accounts where they're trying to stalk their partner or just spoof somebody else's personality. But it's an early stage because I think because there is such a peak of interest around fraud, there is a lot of approaches to online partners from a lot of different areas, and they don't know which one will get them to where they need to be sufficiently. So they're being asked to do things in the online charter, they're being asked to do things by the regulator in the online safety bill. They're asked to be doing voluntary things also within the online fraud group. And still, even beyond that, where you're trying to be quite fixed. So in the online fraud group, there's 3 typologies you look at. In the online charter, there will be so many principles that are looked at. And within Stop Scams, there'll be so many typologies they look at. But that's quite a lot in a range. They've got plenty of employees as well, don't get me wrong. But it's how do they decipher what that means to them and what impact it will have? And that's, I think, part of the narrative that's challenging. At the same time, now that we have capabilities like SMS firewalls, I'm like, WhatsApp scams shouldn't exist really because the data is there. The platform just needs to take it in, and they can take affirmative action once they know who's been targeted or what numbers are trying to be connected to. So there is absolutely more that can be done.
Thank you. And David, I mean, GSMA traditionally, a telco type grouping, but as we've said, fraud is shifting to online platforms. How do you see it playing out in terms of collaboration?
Yeah, so I mean, what we've seen is obviously increasingly those companies also being involved in GSMA. So I remember our first device security group, face-to-face, we decided to put it in Mountain View so that we could get Apple and Google to come to the meeting. And now Google have just been elected chair of the device security group. And what I find is that we learn from each other, basically, because I saw you were talking about direct carrier billing fraud earlier. I don't think these guys fundamentally understand how telco works, and they don't even know who half their partners are. So we're able to kind of help with that, and they're also able to help with us from their insights into their apps and things like that. So I mentioned before that I'm sort of a fan of going to the root causes, and I think dealing with some of those root causes, I mentioned GT leasing. So GT leasing is one of the key entry points for taking over social media accounts, for example, through capturing 2FA codes. And so, but also there's a whole other tree of different actions, including spyware. So if we can deal with that fundamental root cause and really, really hammer it, then we capture a lot of everything else. And I think it's trying to help those companies as well understand that those are the bad practices that we need to eliminate, and also the regulators to be able to know that that's the root cause that we want to stop.
Perfect. We're almost out of time, 10 seconds, in fact. So, Simeon, can I leave the last word to you? Any additional comments about collaboration in the era of online platforms playing a role in fraud?
Last words. Start talking about why we're looking to collaborate, because I think everyone has their own problems. You know, from a parochial view, you might think you have a particular priority, but as soon as you start talking about the broader ecosystems, you really understand the relative complexities, and you help others become aware of this. As David said, you know, so often there are the same common root causes, but until you're collaborating, you won't spot that. Fraud exists because there are so many interconnected ecosystems, and if we don't talk, we will never be able to address that.
Perfect. And I've just realized I may have mispronounced your name, so I do apologize if I have. I'm not doing a very good job of names today. So thank you very much, everyone. Very interesting, and let's get a drink. Thank you.